Peace and love, you beautiful miracles of spiritual level of being. Nathan here from a spiritual level of being, and you have a spiritual level of being. And today I'm going to be discussing the first vegetarians. Now, vegetarianism and pescatarianism derived from the practice of spirituality and religion. Now, we can find sources of this such as through Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, Judaism, Taoism, and even in Greek philosophy and Greek reincarnation cults such as Orphicism. Now, some scholars view Jainism and Buddhism as the first practices of vegetarianism, and the view or religious rule of non-violence towards animals began as early as the 6th century BC. There is some evidence that Jainism picked up this belief beforehand. Some scholars view Hinduism as the first practices of vegetarianism. Though meat eating was allowed, the encouragement for vegetarianism was there. Now, this could be as early as 1500 BC to 500 BC, and this view was in order to have a karmic balance, so that way you're not absorbing in impurities, taking in bad karma, so eating something with a soul in it. So this view was even in Greece, as someone who was vegetarian or even pescatarian was viewed as someone who abstained from eating something with a soul in it. Now, it's possible Buddha was vegetarian, but didn't refuse the food that was offered to him, and that could be meat, as he didn't view as the animal was killed directly for him, as he didn't like the suffering of animals. Now, there were some Buddhist monks who took on this ideology as well. Now, they would be vegetarian, but if food was offered to them, they would eat it with the person who offered them, and that would be regardless of if it was meat or not. Now, some would be very strict and would refuse, but most Buddhists would gladly sit with you and eat. Now, so this idea of taking on impurities or something with a soul in it, kindness towards animals, etc., this view of compassion is what really brought forth this ideology of vegetarianism. Now, there are some claims in Zoroastrianism that Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, was vegetarian. Now, these statements are supported through theological statements. Now, there's an Indian Zoroastrian group named Imel Kishanum, sorry I butchered the name, means science of ecstasy. They are more of a modern form of Zoroastrianism, but they are vegetarian. And they hold this view that the early Zoroastrians were vegetarian, though this belief doesn't go by text beliefs, but rather esoteric beliefs. Now, in Judaism, there were Jewish sects and even Canaanite sects in the early BCs that viewed meat as prohibited, not allowed. There were some that viewed fish as allowed, as they viewed fish not having a soul. Now, the Essene movement, which was vegetarian, some would eat eggs, some wouldn't even eat eggs. Some would drink milk, some would pretty much not drink milk. So some would just only drink grape juice, depending on the form of Essenes. Now, the Essene movement flourished around the 2nd century BC. Now, they dissolved around the 1st century AD. It's argued by some scholars that most likely the Essene movement began around the time of Jonathan Aphus, around 161 to 143 BC. Now, there were medieval scholars such as Joseph Albo and Isaac Arama that viewed the moral ideal of the concern for animals as a moral character. So a small number of Jewish scholars, even throughout history, have argued that the Torah provides a scriptural basis for vegetarianism. Some writers viewed the prophet Isaiah was vegetarian. Now, there were some that believed that the Jewish people were vegetarian during the time of the exile. So there are different views of this type. There are arguments that Jesus and his family were vegetarian. John the Baptist was vegetarian as he was an Essene. Now, his brother who led the Essene movement was James the Righteous. Some argue he was the teacher of righteousness. Well, he was definitely a vegetarian. So this belief in Judaism, as Essene, well, the Essenes were one of the major factions of Judaism. So it's interesting when you come across all these groups. Now, the Taoist in Taoism would promote vegetarianism in order to limit the suffering of sentient life. They are varied in their diet. Some have diet restrictions, don't eat meat at all. It's varied in legend. Now, the view was in Taoism that the deities didn't need meat to survive, but us humans did. Now, if we go to Greece around the 8th century BC to the 8th century AD, during the age of classical antiquity, so the classical age, a vegetarian diet was called the abstinence from beings with a soul in it. So it was a principle or a way of life. So the earliest reliable evidence for vegetarianism in Greece dates to the 6th century BC, and this was a religious movement known as the Orphics. So they were a reincarnation Greek cult. So similar to Gnostics in the sense that to escape the view of reincarnation, but their idea of escaping the reincarnation was to be initiated into the Dionysian mysteries and undergo a ritual of purification or a rebirth of the reliving and suffering of a god. So an esoteric movement. So argued these groups here also contribute to the Gnostics, as a lot of them would have joined these movements that become Christian. Now, this esoteric knowledge as well with vegetarianism, pescatarianism, this dates through the use of the practice of not eating something with a soul in it, so to limit suffering. So a deeper understanding of life. Now Gnosticism, the Gnostic Christians, which also encouraged the practice of vegetarianism and some the practice of pescatarianism, though meat eating was allowed, as it was viewed that it didn't matter what went into your mouth, it's what come out of it that really mattered. Though it was required for some practices of Gnosticism, especially for their bishops, for their main teachers. Now, this view of eating something with a soul in it, so taking on its impurities, you're causing suffering. So this was the view of going to vegetarianism or even pescatarian, as there were Jews, Gnostics, such as a Kafar, that viewed that the fish didn't have a soul in it, that they simply just multiplied, that they were gifts from God, basically. Now, there were some Gnostics that believed plant life had souls in it too. So it all depends on the various types. So the goal to Gnosticism was to limit suffering, as they viewed all life as sacred, that you were in tune with all life, that all life was one. So again, with the practice of spirituality and religion, these ideologies led to a deeper understanding of life to ease suffering. So I'm not here to promote any diets or nothing like that. This is strictly history. Sometimes I go vegetarian, sometimes I eat meat. I go from diets from time to time, from pescatarian to vegetarian to eating meat. You see, we're omnivores, but we have a choice. But what works for you might not work for someone else. So again, this is a history standpoint. Next week I'm going to go vegetarian again. Every couple of months I do it. I go vegetarian for a couple of months. Limit suffering. Now, in my eyes, this is also a fast. So I do it for spiritual reasons, spiritual practices. Now, again, this ideology formed around spirituality, religion. So I enjoyed sharing this bit of history. I wish you all many blessings and many miracles. Connect to one mind and soul. Namaste.